Hello, everybody, and welcome to James Joyce's Trees, which is a talk being given by Chris Wogan. And Chris is currently a PhD student here at the University of York. But in the past, he's been a publisher. He's been working in marketing. He's working in training, and he's doing all kinds of work as well too. But what he's also doing is doing a PhD as well, in his spare time, or his spare time. But he's doing his part-time here. This is absolutely fascinating work that Chris is doing, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. The question of trees doesn't seem to make sense if you're thinking about James Joyce, because you think about James Joyce as an urban writer. In other words, it's all about the city, it's all about city streets, it's all about Dublin, it's all about people talking in pubs, it's all about various things like this. But you wouldn't believe the number of trees that are in James Joyce's work. But right back from the very, very start of Stephen Dedalus, he goes to school in Clongowes Wood College, all the way up to Finnegan's Wake, where so much happens in the Phoenix Park, in mysterious and sometimes mystical tree lands. The interest that Chris is going to talk about is environmental, because it's something to do with the natural world, but it's also to do about the relationship between the city and the country, and it's also to do with the importance of trees and the importance of wood and the importance of everything to do with this and to do with Joyce's work. It sounds as if this is about Joyce, and this is about Joyce and the natural world. So, without further ado, I'd like to pass you over to Chris Wogan, who's going to talk about James Joyce and trees. Chris.
Thank you very much, Matt. First of all, thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you also to the York Festival of Ideas for allowing me to speak today as part of the festival and supporting my talk. My talk today is on James Joyce and trees. Before I get started, I just want to give a quick intro to who James Joyce was, for those of you not familiar with his works. James Joyce was an Irish writer. He wrote in the first half of the 20th century. Most of his key works were published between the years 1907 and 1939, so across a period of about 30 years. And he wrote in different forms, including poetry and drama, but he's best known for his fictional work on the novel, which comprise his most famous works. These are Dubliners, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Ulysses, and Finnegans Wake. And together with his partner Nora Barnacle, Joyce exiled himself from Ireland in 1904 at the age of 22 to go and live in Europe. And he lived for the most part in three European cities, Trieste, Zurich, and Paris. And while all of his works are set in Dublin, the ideas of writers in Europe and the experience of being an exile influenced his writing greatly. And I think that the depiction of trees in his work are also affected by the areas in which he lived. So I'd like to start by focusing on a couple of anecdotes of Joyce that show his personal links to trees in the 1930s. So this is after he has published Ulysses and while he was writing Finnegans Wake. Firstly, in Paris in 1930, Joyce was walking along a road in the sunshine with his friend Paul Léon, and a little girl approached him who wanted to praise him on his writing. As Léon relates, Joyce's reply was affected by his environs. And I quote, Joyce lifted his unfortunate eyes towards the still sunny sky, then brought them back to the box trees growing along the boulevard. Joyce responded, you would do better to admire the sky or even these poor trees. And Joyce's companion confirms that Joyce's reply was not a throwaway remark and makes it clear that this was a candid entreaty. He says of Joyce, this was not false modesty, but a genuine admiration for the natural universe. And by relegating the literary feat of writing Ulysses below sky appreciation and tree watching, I think he shows a humble reverence for more than human organic forms. Joyce's empathy for the natural world leaks into his descriptions of the trees as poor and gestures towards a link between nature and culture that I think his works embody. Secondly, in his later years, Joyce kept his love of trees, growing allusions to them in his writing. Joyce's failing eyesight in the 1930s affected his ability to see trees directly, yet there is evidence he overcame these impairments. In 1931, during a trip to England, Joyce visited Windsor Forest, and on this trip he was accompanied by Kathleen Barnacle, Nora's sister. Joyce's biographer, Richard Ellman, records that, and I quote, as they walked along, he would ask her to name the trees, which he found difficult to see. Both of these anecdotes give an indication that part of the key to understanding some of his most difficult works can be found amongst observing the forms and structures of the natural environment. So what I'm going to do today is give you an overview of how trees are depicted in Joyce's main works. I also want to give you a sense of how his personal experiences with trees and his wide reading of literature that depicts trees inspired him. I'll run you through some direct encounters Joyce had with trees in Ireland, Italy, France, and Switzerland. I'll then discuss some of the key tree intertexts that I think Joyce was using in his works. I'll then move on to talk about specific texts and the different ways trees manifest themselves. This begins with Dubliners, which was published in 1914, and explores how ghosts and spirits are linked to trees in 2 of the 15 short stories. I'll take you through 2 ways to approach Ulysses, which was published in 1922. Firstly, by thinking about the motif of oak trees throughout the text, and secondly, a passage called the Tree Wedding, which sits at the heart of the text. Finally, I'll talk about how the textual form of Finnegans Wake, which was published in 1939, behaves like a linguistic forest through its use of the Irish tree alphabet and forest imagery, and how this might be a productive approach to take when first reading the Wake. And I hope what I have to say today will prove interesting, but if it turns out not to be, then at least you'll get to see some nice pictures of trees. Although Joyce was a city dweller for much of his life, and he is often seen as an urban writer in much of the Joyce criticism, Joyce frequently sought out tree sites that often existed in spaces on the edge of the city or in the country. So in this section, I'm going to try and give you a flavour of different tree encounters Joyce had from his early school days in Ireland to his later years when living in Europe. When Joyce was just 6.5, he attended Clongo's Wood College near Clane in County Kildare, Ireland. This was a lush part of the countryside, replete with trees, especially beside the long tree-lined drive that led to the main building, and around the grounds, which included an orchard. As a truant from lessons, Joyce was once found in the orchard with a school friend, and the apple trees that still stand at Clongo's are possibly 200 years old, and so are the same trees that would have been available as a site for the young Joyce to escape lessons. When he was 12, Joyce went with his father to Cork, who was on a visit to sell some property. And Joyce wrote this experience into a portrait of the artist as a young man and provides a vivid memory of the trees along the Mardyke, another tree-lined avenue that impressed itself upon Joyce. Joyce writes, "Along the Mardyke, the trees were in bloom. The leaves of the trees along the Mardyke were astir and whispering in the sunlight." And this passage is interesting for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it shows trees behaving with a sense of agency, especially as they're described as astir and whispering. And secondly, it shows an awareness of the biology of the leaves of the tree as they photosynthetically connect with sunlight to produce food. Later in Portrait, the text gives more detail of the process of transpiration, the evaporation of water from plant leaves. Joyce describes this as the strange wild smell of the wet leaves and bark. And in this example, Joyce connects the expelling of this tree moisture to a loosening of the portrait's protagonist, Stephen's miseries. On the bottom is the slide is a picture of some of the trees in the area of which Stephen would be walking in Fairview, Dublin. So through this tree description, we get a sense both of the organic processes Joyce is observing and the symbolic connections Joyce is making in his mind, or at least in Stephen's mind, as he walks to university on a rainy morning. And a recent tree report highlighted that there are some rare high-value tree specimens in these grounds. These are a mixture of sycamore, maple, horse chestnut and beech trees. And so the strange wild smell that Joyce writes into Portrait matches up to the blend of these trees, all conducting this process of transpiration at the same time. The photograph on the left of this slide is a famous picture of Joyce's graduation. Joyce is the figure second from the left on the back row, and Joyce's friend Constantine Curran, who arranged the photograph, can be pictured first from the right on the bottom row, seated on the ground. And the tree in the centre of the photograph is an ash tree that still stands in the grounds of University College Dublin. On the right is a photo I took of the same tree in 2024. With a stray branch hovering leaves over Joyce's head, the ash tree emerges from the group of scholars to cement their academic achievement as a celebratory tree of knowledge. And the ash tree becomes important in Joyce's work. Age 17, Joyce alluded to the mythical ash tree Yggdrasil in a 1900 essay called Drama and Life, and it provides a connection to the tree lore of the Druids. It's also notable for being the tree that supplies Stephen's ash plant, and the ash becomes a motif following Stephen's development in both Portrait and Ulysses. In the Circe episode of Ulysses, the ash plant is alluded to 17 times, and it fulfills dramatic functions involving Stephen and Bloom. And recently, a critic, Niall O'Callaghan, has suggested that Joyce's own ash plant originated from an ancient Irish ceremonial site. And so, and I quote here, by snapping off a branch of an ash tree, Joyce would have been crowning himself to a degree and drawing a direct line between himself and ancient Irish royalty. Joyce moved to Trieste in 1905, and the warm climate presented a much different one from that of Ireland. Joyce was also fond of going for walks in the woods, and in this comment on the slide, we see that the shade the trees provide relieved some of the heat from the damn silly sun that makes men into butter. It also helps us understand that Joyce is using the trees for isolation. He says, I sat down miles away from everybody on a bench surrounded by tall trees. And this visit to the Trieste wood is consistent with other trips to forests and woods Joyce made when living in Europe, as we shall see. The photograph on the right is a picture of Trieste from 2023, and in the background you can see some of the wooded areas which loom over the city on the hills. And while it is not possible to know for certain the precise woods Joyce visited, a probable candidate for its size and proximity to Trieste is Parco Farneto, which is over 900,000 square metres and features pine, hornbeam, maple, oak and elm trees. During the First World War, Trieste became a less safe place to stay for Joyce, so they moved to Zurich in 1915, staying there for 4 years. This was an important period of Joyce's life. He had finally, after several failed attempts, managed to publish his collection of short stories, Dubliners, in 1914, and he was in the process of publishing a portrait of the artist as a young man. But more significantly, Joyce was writing the work that became Ulysses. The Joyces lived from January to October 1918 at Universitätsstrasse 38, pictured on the left. Here he wrote 6 episodes of Ulysses, and the site possessed a variety of trees. And the episodes that Joyce wrote while living here also allude to a variety of trees, and these include ash trees, oaks, eucalyptus, poplars, lilac trees, chestnut and plum trees, alongside other references to trees, forests and botany. And Joyce walked along another tree-lined avenue adjacent to Lake Zurich as he told his friend Frank Budgeon about his plans for Ulysses. This is the Uto Quay pictured on the right. And there is also an arboretum, which was established in 1887 and sited on the side of the lake opposite to the Uto Quay. And this features several species from around the world, including beech, ash, redwood and cedar trees. And its prominent location close to both the lake and city, combined with Joyce's frequent walks in this area, meant that Joyce would have been aware of it. Joyce moved to Paris in 1920, and he made it his home for the next 20 years, which would see through the publication of Ulysses, and most of the time he was writing Finnegans Wake. Joyce's first trip to Paris was in 1902, when he intended to study medicine. Instead, he spent most of his time in the library reading literature. And it was during this first visit to Paris that Joyce sent a postcard to his mother stating, "Every Sunday I try and get out into the country. Last Sunday I went out to the woods of Clamart and walked through them to Sèvres, coming back by steamer. I read every day in the Bibliothèque Nationale." In 1904, Joyce wrote in his Polar notebook that Paris was, and I quote, "a lamp for lovers hung in the wood of the world." And Patricia Hutchins has suggested that Paris's gardens, especially the Jardin de Luxembourg, which is on the slide, with its, and I quote, "high compressed groups of chestnuts and romantic pears who take on the shapes of the trees," contributed to Joyce's poetic statement. Later, when Joyce moved back to the French capital, Joyce wrote to Alessandro Bruni, praising the Grandi Alberi, or Great Trees, near his new apartment, which was 10 minutes from the Jardin de Luxembourg, and, I quote, like being 100 kilometres from Paris. So in summary, we can see that wherever he lived, Joyce not only sought out trees for time away from the hustle, but had an active affinity with them. So in this next section, I'm going to talk about a few of the many texts in which Joyce drew upon, which are important for his tree depictions. And while I've covered some of Joyce's own experiences with trees, it really is in the books that he read in which his own tree depictions pay a more substantial debt. I've called this interbranching intertexts because I think there is a link that Joyce uses between the way textual material from other writers that discusses trees and the way in which a tree's branches lean or intersect with other trees. Part of my research suggests there is a process of linking and reciprocation happening that is fundamentally organic, whether it applies to trees or texts. The weight of literary allusion to trees from other texts was a significant force on Joyce. Some of these are among French symbolists, Shakespeare, Milton, Romantic writers, especially Coleridge, 19th century novelists, other Irish writers, and Irish folklore and mythology. For today's talk, I've picked out 3 texts here that Joyce knew, and I believe are important for the way he thought about trees. James Fraser's The Golden Bough is an account of myth and religion that foregrounds tree worship and tree practices across many different cultures around the world. And there is evidence that Joyce knew of these tree mythologies across human culture, as there are references to specific rituals mentioned in Fraser's work. This includes May Day tree fertility rites and the waving of the green bough to accompany a ritual murder, which Joyce writes into Finnegan's Wake as, "They have waved his green boughs o'er him as they have torn him limb from lamb." Secondly, in Wuthering Heights, a famous 1847 novel by Emily Bronte, trees and the processes of death coexist, in which trees become mediators of spirituality. This is a technique I think Joyce puts to work in Dubliners, and which I'm going to come on to discuss more shortly. Finally, A Midsummer Night's Dream, which takes place in the forest of Athens, is one of several Shakespearean forest plays alongside As You Like It and Macbeth, and it has a special relevance for Finnegan's Wake. In The Wake, Joyce reinvents the play as Miss Summer's Nice Dream, and the novel uses the character of Bottom as an alter ego for the character of Sean, or Yawn, as he becomes later on in the novel. But the broader relevance is Shakespeare's use of dreamlike imagery and character switches. The idea of dream transformations that occur in a dark forest is very close to what Joyce is doing in Finnegan's Wake. However, it is not just characters and their names that change in the Wake, but language itself. I think that Joyce adopted the idea of forest metamorphoses from writers like Shakespeare and began applying it to words. Thus, the idea of a forest, borrowed from A Midsummer Night's Dream, is a useful structure for viewing how to first read The Wake. It is very dark and confusing. You can't see much. Everything seems to change shape, and nothing really is what you think it is. So in summary, there are many texts that have used trees as symbols and material entities, and alongside his personal encounters with trees, these are important influences on the way Joyce chose to depict trees in his works. Trees are sparse in Dubliners, and when they do occur, they are often depicted in intentional ways. 2 short stories that feature trees in this way are A Painful Case, the story of a man who breaks off relations with a married woman who years later goes on to commit suicide, and The Dead, in which Gabriel Conroy discovers that his wife is still grieving for an old boyfriend she met in her youth. In these stories, Joyce is subtly addressing ideas of spiritualism. How do forms of communication that are imperceptible to humans be planted within texts? And to represent this connection, Joyce located an analogy between the communing with the dead through spiritualism and the indecipherable language of trees. And in order to do this, I think that Joyce was inspired specifically by Emily Bronte's spiritual tree imagery, and that the material and symbolic properties of the tree in Wuthering Heights' narrative are transposed into the dead. Firstly, I want to share with you a passage from Painful Case, which describes James Duffy walking through Phoenix Park after learning of Emily Sinico's death. Joyce writes, "The night was cold and gloomy, he entered the park by the first gate and walked along under the gaunt trees. He walked through the bleak alleys where they had walked 4 years before. She seemed to be near him in the darkness. At moments, he seemed to feel her voice touch his ear, her hand touch his. He stood still to listen. In this passage, spectral conditions are gathering in Phoenix Park in Dublin. The night is cold and gloomy, the alleys are bleak, and the trees are gaunt. And the word gaunt, which almost sounds like haunt, duplicates this frail quality of connection to the spiritual world which Mr. Duffy experiences. Mrs. Sinico seemed to be near him. He seemed to feel her voice. So the link to her is precarious, and when it is broken, it is followed by a sense of Spartan absence. The trees' presence are passive and soundless. They are real, yet the appearance of Mrs. Sinico's ghost remains uncertain and inconclusive. And in this example, Joyce is enlisting the ghostly yet living properties of the arboreal as a staging point to mediate the intercession of dead spirits in the world of the living. The final story in Dubliners is The Dead, and in these extracts on the slide, which come at the very end of the story, Greta Conroy tells to her husband Gabriel the moment in which she last saw her old boyfriend Michael Fury. Joyce writes, "I implored of him to go home at once and told him he would get his death in the rain, but he said he did not want to live. I can see his eyes as well. He was standing at the end of the wall where there was a tree." And in what is perhaps slightly clumsy syntax, Joyce positions the word tree at the end of Greta's sentence, making it conspicuous and meaningful. And Gabriel later seizes on this image of the dripping tree as, and I quote, "the tears gathered more thickly in his eyes." And these images of sodden trees are comparable to the moments in Wuthering Heights when Heathcliff waits by an old ash tree to hear of the news of Cathy Earnshaw's death. Bronte writes, he was there at least a few yards further in the park, leant against an old ash tree, his hat off, and his hair soaked with the dew that had gathered on the budded branches and fell pattering around him. And Heathcliff's moisture amid the budded branches is an inspiration for the rain-soaked tree under which Michael Fury patiently waits in The Dead, and the mixing of this moisture with Gabriel's tears. The dripping tree becomes a site of intercession for Gabriel as, just as in A Painful Case, the following sentence in The Dead makes clear. Other forms were near. His soul had approached that region where dwell the vast hosts of the dead. Gabriel's thoughts seize upon the symbolic import of the dripping tree, linking the rain with the tree to conjure a liquid image signifying dissolution, transformation, and the intercession of the living by the dead. And while Joyce utilises Heathcliff's Vigil tree site to represent Michael Fury's love for Greta, it is really Cathy's lingering spirit that Joyce fosters to depict Fury. Fury has haunted Greta for a number of years, similar to the way that Cathy haunts Heathcliff. And there is more tree imagery to strengthen the link between the dead and Wuthering Heights, and this occurs through the word tap, which has a specific meaning within spiritualist practice. To tap is an audible method in which spirits may communicate with the mortal through seances. In The Dead, tapping appears towards the end of the story when, and I quote, Gabriel's warm trembling fingers tap the cold pane of the window. The sound of taps return when the snow strikes the window pane. A few light taps upon the pane made him turn to the window. There is a sense in which these taps offer a communion with the dead, and the snow tree imagery of the taps also occurs in Wuthering Heights. At the very start of the novel, Lockwood dreams of Cathy Earnshaw breaking in through his window when he mistakes the sound of a fir tree branch for her arm. And it is the sound of the taps in which spiritualist activity is rendered. Bronte writes, "I began to dream. The snow lay yards deep in our road. Branderham, unwilling to remain idle, poured forth his zeal in a shower of loud taps on the boards of the pulpit. And what was it that had suggested the tremendous tumult? Merely the branch of a fir tree that touched my lattice." By comparing the fir tree branch to a human arm, Bronte emphasises a material link between human and tree bodies. And the shower of loud taps that disturb Lockwood's sleep are changed in his dream from a tree branch striking the window to wooden banging noise heard during a lively sermon. and Joyce adopts a similar mode of arboreal embodiment. Critic Richard Gerber writes that, and I quote, "The sound of people tapping, patting, and making other recurrent noises serve a common purpose in the dead. They are symbolic reminders of the omnipresence of the dead among the living." And the links between tree taps and spirits begun in the dead do become a connection of significance for Joyce. So on to Ulysses now. And in Ulysses, Joyce's tree use experiments closely with models of ecology, language, and biology, all of which intersect with trees. And just as a quick recap, Ulysses is a novel in which all of the action takes place on a single day in June in Dublin in 1904. It centres largely on three characters, Stephen Dedalus, Leopold Bloom, and his wife, Molly Bloom. And the novel uses interior monologue for all three characters, which was revolutionary for its time, and it also makes parallels to Homer's Odyssey throughout. And rather than being a thrilling page-turner, it is a novel that keeps on giving. No matter how many times you read it, there is always going to be something new to learn. There is a link between trees and language through Joyce's use of the genealogical tree of language and his interest in etymological roots. And there are also some images of trees as vessels of fertility that become important at the end of the novel. This slide just gives you a sense of the different tree species which occur across Ulysses' 18 episodes. And what is interesting about this map is that some species repeat regularly, like the oak, and which I'll talk more about shortly. There are some species which are non-native to Ireland where the novel is set, and reflect both Leopold Bloom's imaginings of warmer climates and Molly Bloom's Gibraltar origins. It's also notable that the variety of tree species accumulates with more intensity the further you go into the novel, and the wilder the different styles of each episode grow. For example, in Cyclops, an episode of gigantism, lists, and parodies, there is a magnificent tree celebration which lists many tree species, and again, which I'm going to come on to talk about soon. In summary, there are tree species everywhere in Ulysses if you were paying close attention. In fact, there is far too much going on in Ulysses in terms of trees for me to cover in today's talk. So instead, what I focused on are two areas which I think will help readers get an understanding of what Joyce is doing with trees in this text, and also help first-time readers get into Ulysses and see how the text functions across the different episodes. The first of these is the oak motif, which runs throughout the text, and the second is a section of the text that has come to be known as the tree wedding. In Ulysses, the wider network of oak allusions across the text comprise a range of associations. In Telemachus, on the novel's first few pages, Buck Mulligan's hair is grained and hued like pale oak, and also described as oak pale. In Aeolus, the newspaper headline style describes William Braden as Esquire of Oakland's Sandymount. And in Lestrygonians, Bloom's stream of consciousness recollects that after Goodwin's concert in the supper room or oak room of the mansion house. And in these three examples, we see how the oak motif stretches from human hair to estate and land to expensive furnishings indicating class. Later in the same episode, Bloom's thoughts on wood graining and form become more focused. Joyce writes, "Nice piece of wood in that counter, nicely planed, like the way it curves there." His downcast eyes followed the silent veining of the oaken slab. Beauty, it curves. Curves are beauty, shapely goddesses. And in this example, Bloom appreciates what were once vascular channels in the tree's biology, and trees' veining is demonstrable proof of, like humans, their organic life. And the description of curves shows Bloom connecting the natural shapes within trees to an aesthetic culture comprising human, non-human, and divine organisms. In Circe, the oak allusions recall the tree mythology as described in Fraser's The Golden Bough, including Egeria, who Fraser describes as one of the oak nymphs whom the Romans believed to preside over every green oak grove. In Circe, the liberation of a nymph from an oak frame precedes the vocalization of yew trees. Out of her oak frame, a nymph with hair unbound, lightly clad in tea-brown art colours, descends from her grotto and passing under interlacing yews stands over Bloom. In Ithaca, the oak motif further represents the link between woods and words by connecting trees to the authoritative volumes of knowledge and language. Joyce writes, "Fumed oak sectional bookcase containing the Encyclopaedia Britannica, a New Century Dictionary." And later, a staircase described of vanished clear-grained oak develops the designs of Bloom's property plans and strengthens the link to the inner veins of wood he thought about in Lestrygonians. The grains of oak illustrate internal flows of fluid through biotic fibres, mirroring Bloom's interior mental processes. And in summary, the oak motif becomes embedded within Bloom's psychology, exposing old myths and erotic desire alongside the practical qualities of oak for human habitats and reading books. And the oak references intensify in what is known as the tree wedding of Cyclops, which presents one of the wedding guests as Mrs. Norma Holyoake of Oakhome Regis. This passage follows a discussion about deforestation in Ireland in a Dublin pub. It is a third-person parody of a wedding between John Wyse de Nolan, or John Wyse Nolan, and a bride known as Miss Fir Conifer. And this is a comic passage in which Joyce goes to town on everything arboreal and more. And what is especially interesting is how the tree wedding makes textual ecosystems and environmental networks visible within Ulysses. This network operates botanically because climbing shrubs like honeysuckle and Virginia creeper engage trees as structural supports. Dewy mosses use surplus water from tree barks to create tree habitats, and pollinator bees fertilize flowers on shrubs and trees to produce fruits and nuts, which contain seeds for the continuation of their species. This network works textually through poetic techniques that Joyce uses to wed tree names to each other. For example, comic effects like alliteration are used by Joyce to bond the names of Holly Hazel Eyes, Myra Myrtle, and Maud Mahogany. More broadly, the materials of language here become wedded to ecology and its processes. When subsequent words use sounds repeated from preceding words, they become wedded to each other, reinforcing the passage's substantive wedding theme through its form. And in summary, the poetic effects of the tree wedding models an exchange to that which constitutes a successfully subsisting ecosystem. So on to Finnegans Wake now. Joyce wrote Finnegans Wake from 1923, publishing it in serial form until its publication as a book in 1939. And in terms of summarising what the book's about, one thing that can be said is that the book focuses on a family consisting of a father and mother named by their initials HCE and ALP, their twin boys Sean and Shem, and their daughter Izzy. It is a book that is intimidating for first-time readers, yet it is a book full of fun, humour, wordplay, and lots of environmental imagery, including trees. And in this section, I want to try to persuade you to view the whole text as a literary forest, one that is often dark and confusing, but can become navigable once you have found your bearings amongst the trees. There are a couple of reasons why I think the forest metaphor is particularly relevant for Finnegans Wake. Firstly, Joyce used the ancient Irish tree alphabet, Ogam or Ogham, in writing specific sections, which suggests that trees are an important element of understanding some of the language in the novel. And secondly, the time in which Joyce was writing was one where there was growing political pressure on diversity, as applied to the human race as well as environmental diversity. And in one way, through the plurality of tree species, which mirrors the plurality of languages in Finnegans Wake, Joyce was presenting his own response to the political debates of the time. This slide just gives you a sense of how many tree allusions there are in Finnegans Wake. The Wake is split into 4 books, and there are 17 chapters in total, 8 in the first, 4 each in books 2 and 3, and finally 1 chapter in book 4. And I just want to give this slide as an example of how trees are everywhere in the Wake. You don't have to flip too many pages before you encounter some kind of tree or arboreal allusion of some kind. It also shows that there is an intensification of tree allusions in specific chapters at the end of the novel, especially in books 2-3, 3-3, and 3-4. And these are chapters which largely feature the main character HCE, who is rumoured in the novel to have committed some indiscretion in Phoenix Park. So one way to interpret this is that there is a correlation Joyce is making between HCE and trees in these chapters. One way in which the forest rears its head in the Wake is through Ogham, the Irish tree alphabet. This is an old alphabet where each letter corresponded to a tree, as can be seen in the panel on the right of the slide. And I've included those specific letters because at one point in the text, which is about HCE in the pub, Joyce hides a coded message by using trees to spell out an anagram. This part of text is on the slide and I'll read it out. And teach him twisters in tongue Irish. Pat lad may go to quicken aspen, ash and yew, willow broom with oak for you. And we know that Joyce is making an Ogham reference due to the way he spells the word go as G-O-H. The additional H tells the reader that there is something else going on. And these three letters are the first three letters of Ogham. There is also the allusion to Twisters in Tongue Irish. And then we get a list of 7 trees. Each of these trees corresponds to a letter, as seen on the slide. And the final result is the letters L-E-N-I-S-O-D. Some critics have suggested that this phrase could be demarcated to provide the 2 words len isod, or which translates to with Isolt, or as a direct reference to the character of Isolde. This is a link both to the story of Tristan and Isolt, which has connections to Chapel Izard, where the wake is set, and it also links to the character of Issy, sister to Sean and Shem, daughter of HCE and ALP, the family at the centre of the wake. So in this way, we can see that Joyce is having fun with trees and language, making codes using the Irish tree alphabet that contain allusions to the narrative's characters. And there are other Ogham allusions listed throughout the wake text. One effect of this example is to draw into question that when Joyce talks of trees, is he referring to Ogham or something else? And this only becomes clear when you look closely. So there are political and cultural contexts to consider when thinking about the forests of the wake. One quote Joyce makes relatively early in the wake in 1:4, which describes the birth of HCE, stands out for its lucidity, and this is the passage on the slide, which I'll read out to you now. Mr. Whitlock gave him a piece of wood. What words of power were made fast between them? Eke names and orc gnomes, acnomina, ecnumina. That, oh that, did Hansard tell us, would Gargan's Dub's earwag in every pub of all the sitter. Batty believes a batten, while Hogan hears a hod, yet here prefers a Punselschapner, and Cope and Bull go cup and ball. And the Cassidy, Craddock, Roman ream round era weege, ne'er a wage, is still immer and immor a wagering over it. A cradle with a care in it, or a casket with a kick behind. Toties, testes, quoties, questies. The war is in words, and the wood is the world. And the war is in words, and the wood is the world is a conspicuous phrase because it opts out of the wake's mode of puns and portmanteaus. This sentence offers, I think, a metaphor about the item of wood now possessed by HCE that represents the entire globe. As a microcosm of the entire text of the wake, the war is in words and the wood is the world links poetry with symbolism as a metatextual guide for readers through the text. We know that Joyce discovered the forest as metaphor for the earth early in his life, and he wrote in his polar notebook in late 1904, Paris, a lamp for lovers hung in the wood of the world. But here, the wake sentence creates a broad metaphor which ascribes mystery, darkness, and hostility to forests. Forests become an unknown expanse with the potential to overwhelm. Joyce wrote this phrase, the war is in words and the wood is the world, between 1937 and 1938, when the imminence of global war was palpable in the language of European politics. And at a time when difference or divergence was under threat, Joyce put into the wake a diversity of tree species to offer a passive counterbalance to narratives of violent domination. They provide an analogy to the text's use of linguistic plurality. When viewed within the context of the 1930s, the wake defines woods as a site where the convergence between trees and language offers pacifist resistance to the eugenics of the 1930s. It also replicates visions of forests and woods in the works of several writers, which include Dante, whose epic poem, The Divine Comedy, begins with a description of a selva oscura, or a dark wood. And it also alludes to Vico, upon whose work the wake is based structurally. Vico wrote in his New Science several times of the La Gran Selva della Terra, which translates to the Earth's Great Forest, or the World's Great Forest, which is a virtual transposition of the wood is the world. And Italian politics is something Joyce was immersed in when he first moved to the continent. So the relations between Italian writers Dante and Vico, with the presentation of a dark wood about to experience war, is therefore a way for Joyce to foreground the Arborian environment and draw attention to the way that cultural histories are being appropriated and resituate them within a context of diversity and plurality. Thank you very much.
That's wonderful. Chris, thank you very, very much indeed. Some terrific material there, and right across all the work of James Joyce is quite amazing, all the way up to that fantastic sentence at the end: the war is in the words, and the wood is the world," which is this brilliant thing in the middle of Finnegan's Wake. Um, I was just wondering whenever you were talking about Italian politics at the end there, whether there's something to do with the fascist bundle of sticks, which is he aware of that? Does he have any fun playing with that in Finnegan's Wake?
Well, I haven't found a link to that yet, but certainly that certainly does sound like it's something that would Joyce would make good use of.
Yeah, yeah, but he was certainly not in, no, always always opposed to that kind of political thinking because it's multitudinous and completely pluralist thinking. That's wonderful. Thank you very, very much, Chris. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A for everybody who's out there. And we're more than welcome to have more questions if you want. So please do fire in a couple of questions. So I'll just start off with Zoe, who asked the first question, and I'll read it out for you. And Zoe is thanks you very, very much. And which is kind of a general question. If for you, Chris, which is how you became interested in Joyce. Was your research always going to be about Joyce? And were the trees a way into the research or something that caught your interest after you'd started reading Joyce?
Yeah, thank you very much, Zoe. That's a really great question. I've been interested in Joyce for a long time. I read him firstly as a teenager in a Catholic school, reading A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and immediately identified with Stephen Dedalus, the main character. But it took me several more years before I could read Ulysses, and an even longer period before I could read Finnegan's Wake. And in fact, I had to read about three books about the Wake before I could actually tackle reading it itself. But I was always fascinated by Joyce. I was always fascinated by what he was doing with language, the fact that his texts always seemed to innovate from the previous text. And I suppose my work on trees, um, if it's not too much of a pun, grew out of my work in my master's, where I did my dissertation was on flowers in Finnegan's Wake. And I read a really great book of criticism called The Ecology of Finnegan's Wake by Alison Lascivita. And that really, as I was hunting, I knew that I wanted to write on Finnegan's Wake because it was a text that had fascinated me for years, but I was hunting around for a topic. And that book really led me in the direction of the ecological and eco-critical. And so having looked at the flowers in Finnegan's Wake, which is another really great way into that text because there's so much kind of environmental imagery there. I then wanted to kind of broaden out and look at all of Joyce, which is what I'm doing for my PhD, but focusing on something slightly different. So I picked trees, which was kind of related to the flowers, but also different. So yeah, great question. Thank you, Zoe.
Okay. Thank you very much, Zoe. And Andy has asked a very, very similar question. So, but I think that to sort of think a little bit more about Andy's question, which kind of follows up from that, is but how did you locate meaning in trees?
Yeah,
What do
that's
trees mean? Yes.
that's a really good question. And when I started researching this topic, I knew instinctively that there were a lot of trees in Joyce's work, but I didn't really know what it all meant. And I mean, I haven't talked about this today, but right from his very early poetry, he released a volume of poetry called Chamber Music in 1907, and that those poems are also full of trees as well. So right from the very start, Joyce was writing about trees. Um, I think he's doing lots of different things in his different texts. Certainly in his early texts in chamber music in Dubliners, he's heavily influenced by symbolist writers writing in Europe, and so the tree as a symbol of other things is really important. But I think as he grew into writing Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, became more interested in the scientific aspects of trees, their materiality, their biological processes, and also their links to philology and how they're a useful metaphor for how languages evolve. And Joyce was obviously fascinated by language. So one of my ideas is that he was continuously using trees as a scaffold for his language experiments. And I think in Finnegan's Wake, which is probably the least read of Joyce's work, um, this tree use grows exponentially. There's just so much tree imagery in the text. So I think that is something that really kind of helps prove that point that there is this close relationship between trees and language.
Yeah, good. Very good. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions about Ulysses from Shadi and from Ben. And just to think about, so we've got a more general question from Shadi, which is about Ulysses, a general question about Ulysses. And they ask, would you say after having been this immersed in Ulysses that it is as epic as the Odyssey?
Well, thank you, Shadi. That's a great question. Um, I think it's probably epic, but in a completely different way. And I think that was Joyce's point. The parallels between the Odyssey in Ulysses are they're not kind of rigid. They're very kind of comedic and meant to kind of generate a lot of humor. So while he used the Odyssey as a kind of trellis for Ulysses, what Joyce is doing with language is epic in a completely different way to what Homer was doing, I think. Hopefully that answers your question.
That's a very good answer, Chris. That's a hard question, that one. And finally from Ben here, and Ben has a question, which is, what is your favorite episode in Ulysses and why?
Yeah, Ben, that's another really great question. Thank you very much for that. Um, I mean, this varies depending on what kind of mood I'm feeling in. But I mean, Joyce's favorite episode was famously Ithaca, which is this catechistic style of language that's the penultimate episode of Ulysses. I think after having studied it, my favorite episode at the moment is Proteus, which is the third episode. It's the episode where Stephen is walking along Sandymount Strand and he's just unraveling things in his head. And that's just it's a quite hard episode to read when you're first reading Ulysses, but there's so much beautiful language in it. As you go into kind of Stephen's mind, there's so many kind of links and associations that he's making between different things. That's an episode that I always come back to. And I live quite close to the coast and quite often go for walks on the beach. So I often think about that episode when I'm doing that.
I think if I was going to answer that question, I'd have to say it was Penelope, which is Molly Bloom's soliloquy. And where you kind of think it's kind of the last thing that I teach at my Joyce course, my foot to the undergraduate students, and it's a really brilliant thing to have at the end of a course when you think it doesn't get much better than this. Although I remember last year going in and saying to a bunch of students, it doesn't get much better than this, and I think they were a bit shocked. And they thought, hang on a second, maybe this is just a bit too explicit and edgy for us. Yes. But I think everybody has their favorite in that book as well too, and it's a book which has so many enthusiasts.
I
And
think I think
Ben,
that's the great
yeah,
thing about Ulysses
yeah,
is that there's so many different styles
yeah,
that once you read the whole book, there will be some episodes that you hate, but there will also be some episodes that you
yeah,
will love.
yeah, yeah. Ben, who'd asked the question about your favorite episode, said that his favorite episode is Circe, and I must say that is amazing as well too. And for those of you out there who have yet to read Ulysses, Circe is the one that's set in the night town area of Dublin, and the whole thing is written out like a stage play or a film script or whatever it is. It's utterly unperformable, and it's utterly filmable as well. Although some people have tried to do that actually, but it's the most extraordinary, hilarious, and again, it has to be said, quite shocking thing. Yeah, it's brilliant as well too. So anyway, Chris, those are all the questions that we've got there, and thanks very much to everybody who asked the questions there too. I must say that was just a wonderful talk, and it was beautifully clear with some fantastic images, and it's lovely to hear somebody talking about the Irish Ogham script as well too. Okay. So anyway, thank you all very much for coming. And we're going to leave the talk right now. And once again, if you can virtually applaud Chris Wogan for a wonderful talk about James Joyce's trees. Thank you very much.